Hi, and thanks for joining us today for our talk on the Jewish communities in Cowbridge, Penarth, and Barry. We've been putting together a series of talks recently that look at the smaller Jewish communities that were dotted around the South Wales valleys, and many of them are no longer in existence. My name's Laura Henley Harrison, and I am the project officer for the Jewish History Association of South Wales. And so today I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Cowbridge, Penarth, and Barry. So our most recent series of talks have been focused on the towns in South Wales which had a very small Jewish community, with many often vanishing by the mid-20th century. I would like to firstly give a brief overview of what life was like for Jews in these small towns compared to larger cities with a higher Jewish population, such as Cardiff and Swansea. Then I'll go on to talk about some more locally relevant stories in the Vale of Glamorgan. An important part of the work we do at the Jewish History Association of South Wales is recording oral history interviews with Jewish people who have a story to tell about living in Wales. I would like to include some clips from our interviews so that you can hear some experiences of Jewish community life in their own voices. So first, I would like to explain a little background regarding Jewish religious practices. For the Orthodox community, there is a requirement to have a regular minyan to become established as an official community. A minyan is a group of 10 men over the age of 13. Although Jews can worship in a synagogue or at home if there is not a minyan, there are a number of prayers which cannot be recited if this number is not met. For example, the Kaddish, which is the prayer in memory of the dead. Areas such as Cowbridge, Penarth, and Barry did not have their own synagogue. This would often mean travelling to the nearest synagogue for Sabbath and the festivals. This task was made even more difficult because Orthodox Jews are not allowed to use any form of mechanized transport on the Sabbath, so they would have to walk many miles to attend a service. It should be noted that many of these valleys communities were in existence in the late 1800s and early to mid-1900s, so the transport issue would have been even more challenging. It's therefore likely that they would have worshipped at home for the Sabbath, but would have made the journey to a nearby synagogue on high holidays such as Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year in the Jewish calendar, and this takes place at the end of summer or early autumn. Here, Anthony Hyatt discusses the problems associated with this when his family lived in Tredegar.
So can you remember the synagogue? Can you describe the synagogue?
Oh, I can't remember that way. I do remember it. It was very small because we used to walk you had to have a quorum of 10, and when all the people left just after the war, we used to walk then from Tredegar on the festival to the synagogue in Bramau, and also to Merthyr had a thriving community, and Bramau had one. But Tredegar, we never had a quorum there, so the synagogue more or less was let out as a shop, I think, then, and then it was made into a house when Michael Foote bought it. But I cannot remember, but I remember going to walking to Bramau 5 miles, and I can remember going to Bramau, and it killed me, walking in on the evening of Kol Nidre, which is Yom Kippur, walking across Romney Bridge in the freezing cold with my grandfather and a gentleman called Abe Sherman of the football pools wouldn't let me go home and put me up the night in his home and took me back the next day by car because he wouldn't let me walk. I was only a little boy, about 7 or 8 years of age, and the weather was so... But my grandfather stayed in a pub somewhere and they wouldn't let me in. I do have very fond memories of that. Romney Bridge in the freezing cold.
We can safely assume that these early Jewish arrivals were Orthodox families, because we do not have any records of Reformed Jewish communities arriving in South Wales until the beginning of the Second World War, when they left their homes in Western and Mid-Europe to flee persecution by the Nazi Party. The earlier Jews arriving in the valleys tended to come from Eastern Europe, which was previously part of the Russian Empire, to escape violent pogroms and enforce conscription into the Russian army, where Jews were treated extremely badly. Having no established community in these smaller towns would also mean that there were no local provisions for kosher food, so this would also involve travel and storage of meat, which was difficult pre-refrigeration. It would have involved some creative thinking in the kitchen to remain observant. Bringing us more up to date, these small communities still face these difficulties during the 1970s and beyond. Bennett Aaron here describes how his family would source their kosher food as the only Jewish family in Port Talbot without any access to local kosher provisions.
Because did your family keep kosher in the house?
They did, yes, absolutely.
So where did they get the food from then, if you were such a small number of Jews in their village?
The Cardiff. So we would go on a trip every month, as far as I can remember, to Cardiff. I remember we go to the butchers in Cardiff. I still remember, I mean, as a child, I can still smell the smell of meat and sawdust on the floor of the butchers when I think about it, which even as a child I didn't like. I mean, now I haven't eaten meat now for about 30 years, but I still got that memory of that. And the guy said, and having the chickens out the back, and it was all a bit weird. So we would go and get the food, as far as I can remember, from Cardiff.
Another challenge faced by Jews in these small valleys towns was Saturday trading. This story gives some insight into the issues faced by Jews in Llanelli. This is taken from our upcoming Swansea Trail, which should be going live on our website in early 2024. Hannah Hirsch, previously Solomon, describes her childhood in the early 1900s in Llanelli. Her family ran a small hardware shop where they sold paraffin, soap, paint, cups and saucers, scrubbing brushes, and other daily household items. The hardware shop was next door to the family home in New Dock Road, and they also ran a small drapery business from their front room, selling blouses, socks, stockings, and undergarments. Small Jewish businesses often suffered as a consequence of being closed on Saturday because it was forbidden to work on the Sabbath. As Saturday was the main shopping day when workers received their wages, it was always difficult to hear the knock on the door to purchase goods and being able to serve the customers until Monday because there was no Sunday trading at that time. In Jewish tradition, Sabbath ends when 3 stars are seen in the sky on a Saturday night. If customers turned up earlier, then they would not be served. If locals were in need of items over the weekend, they would come early on a Saturday evening and shout impatiently through the letterbox, "It's all right, Mrs. Solomon, you can open up, I've seen 3 stars." This is a wonderful account of community cohesion and shows that the local non-Jewish population were generally accepting of what must have seemed strange new practices entering the valleys during the mid to late 1800s. The very earliest arrivals often found work as packmen or peddlers. They would walk through the valleys, towns and villages with packs selling goods door to door. This was a well-received service, and they would often allow customers to have the item and pay at a later date, or in instalments, which helped people afford the things they needed on a low income. There are very few accounts of Jewish people becoming miners. They would be more often established in businesses which served the mining community, such as furniture dealers, pawnbrokers, picture framers, glaziers, jewelers, tailors, and drapers. Here's a short clip from David Jacobs about Jewish occupations in South Wales.
So you take from your work that mining was not a huge career choice then for Jews?
I think that's probably right, yes. I think Jews went into things like pawnbroking, as my great-great-uncle, my great-grandfather's brother, Isaac Monat Jacobs, Isaac McJacobs, he was a pawnbroker in Abertillery.
So they were more into serving the community?
Yeah, shopkeepers, small shopkeepers. Well, they as they were in Eastern Europe.
So this was a little bit of general background on the arrival and professions of Jews in these smaller towns in South Wales, and also some of the issues they faced keeping their faith when they were not part of a large community. So now I would like to look at something a bit more local, which ties in well with the issues of keeping to Jewish traditions and religious laws. Something people don't consider is the special requirements for elderly Jewish people. For Orthodox Jews, it would be very difficult to move into a non-Jewish care home. As members of the South Wales Jewish population aged, it became a necessity to provide a place for them to spend their final years where they could be properly provided for with kosher food and regular worship, including observance of the festivals throughout the year. So on Sunday, the 21st of July, 1946, a ceremonial golden key unlocked the doors of the first and only retirement home for the Jewish community in South Wales. What began as a small residential care home in the heart of Canton in Cardiff grew into a well-loved and well-respected institution, which supported and nursed the elderly members of the local Jewish community for over 70 years. The pressing need for this home was first raised at a public meeting at the Cardiff Jewish Institute in 1945 by Henry Silver. Henry visualized, and I quote, "a haven of rest for our old people, where the traditions of Judaism would be upheld and contentment and the finest care and attention attend them in the evening of their lives." In response to this meeting, 10 St John's Crescent in Campton, Cardiff, was purchased, and Henry Silver became the first president of the home. Henry had arrived in Cardiff from Poland with his family in 1914 when he was 17 years old. Within 10 years, he had mastered the English language, married, started his own business, and involved himself in many facets of the Jewish community, eventually becoming president of Cardiff United Synagogue. Henry Silver led a life of devoted service to his community, but the creation of the home was known as his greatest achievement. Due to the high quality of care provided at the home, they received far more applications than they could be accommodated. The home removed the stress of loneliness in later years and kept the residents involved in the community while maintaining their Orthodox lifestyle. The original home opened with 6 rooms, which had space for 8 residents, and they filled up quickly. So after 2 years in Canton, the decision was taken to relocate the home to Penarth so that more residents could be accepted. Home Towers was a beautiful period mansion house on Bridgeman Road in Penarth, with large gardens overlooking the sea. It was officially opened on Sunday the 5th of December 1948 by the Chief Rabbi Israel Brody and Morris Rapport, who was presented with a golden ceremonial key on the occasion by Henry Silver. So here's a photograph of the official opening of Home Towers in Penarth in 1948, and it gives a list there of all of the people who were present. And here they are with the ceremonial golden key. In 1972, Morris Rapport's son, Alderman Cecil Rapport, recalled fondly the birth of the idea of the home. It took place during a conversation between Henry Silver and Cecil's mother-in-law, Rose Flegelston. Cecil still possessed both of his father's golden keys, but in his speech he declared, "The keys are not needed, the doors are never locked, the door is ever open for those who seek a haven." A reception and dinner were held at the Drill Hall in Dumfries Place in Cardiff. The event exceeded capacity and supporters came from many communities across South Wales and Monmouthshire. The reception at the Drill Hall hosted around 600 people and was presided over by Henry Silver, who spoke of the efforts undertaken and the generous donations received to open this new premise at a cost of £10,000. In the annual report for 1947 and 1948, Henry spoke of their intention to use the extra space to begin accepting a number of bed patients who would be provided every comfort. The home was now evolving and adapting to the pressing needs of the local ageing Jewish community. The home took every care of its residents, including taking them out for many day trips where they would travel to the local seaside towns and have lunch, and they often visited Coldnap at Barry Island. Penarth did not have its own synagogue in the town, and newspaper articles from 1910 and 1913 confirms that the Jews in Penarth most likely attended Cathedral Road Synagogue in Cardiff, which was 4.5 miles away. In 1892, there were enough Jewish people to form a Jewish club in Penarth, and they would regularly get together to raise money for local causes, including colliery disasters and also local infirmaries. However, for 10 years, there was a synagogue inside Home Towers. Kind donations enabled the home to use one of their spacious rooms as a synagogue, thereby maintaining the religious life of the residents during their time in Penarth. Now that a larger property had been secured, plans moved ahead for the addition of a much-needed medical ward. As the residents became older, their health requirements often changed dramatically, and Home Towers had to evolve with them. Due to the previous focus on residential care only, they lacked the specialist facilities to care for residents with more debilitating health requirements. Pleas for donations were printed in KJX magazine in 1953, with the hope of hitting a £5,000 target. From 1955, the new president of Home Towers was Mr. M.J. Cohen, who had arrived in South Wales many years earlier from a small town in Ukraine. He was highly focused on public service and also served as president of Cardiff United Synagogue, as did his predecessor Henry Silver. The financial independence of the home was solely reliant on the generosity of private donors and local fundraising events. Their pleas were heard and the home achieved their target, but management were now in a dilemma about how best to use the money. Should it be spent enhancing and extending the facilities at Home Towers, or would it be more beneficial to look for larger and more suitable premises elsewhere? By the summer of 1957, the decision had been made, and plans were devised to return the home to its roots in Cardiff. This would allow for further expansion of residential rooms and also provide space for the sick bay and allow the home to fully embrace its dual purpose of residential and specialist nursing care. Although the proposed relocation to Cardiff would benefit the residents with more specialised facilities, it was also integral to their happiness and well-being in other ways. Many had expressed that they were finding life in Penarth lonely and they were missing the closeness of their family and friends. So it was time for the home to return to the heart of the Jewish community in Cardiff. By 1958, the third and final property had been acquired on Penellan Hill in Cardiff. It underwent many changes throughout the years and continued to provide high-quality care to its Jewish residents until the need for such a large property became unnecessary. In 2011, Penellan House was sold to Link Cymru. The name was retained and a smaller building was built with a guarantee of 30 places to be held for Jewish residents until such time as this was no longer needed by the community. Today, Penellan House is still open, but has less than 5 Jewish residents. So next, I would like to look at some Jewish history in Cowbridge. I researched articles and announcements in the Jewish Chronicle from the year it began publication in 1841, and it became apparent that hardly any Jewish people settled in Cowbridge, and certainly never enough to establish an official community. I did come across one lovely advert from A. Overton, who lived in Picton Cottage in Llanbleddia near Cowbridge in 1903. They've written into the newspaper to sing the praises of Neve's food for infants, invalids and the aged, and it proudly states at the bottom that it's used in the Russian Imperial Nursery. However, Cowbridge did have some temporary Jewish residents who stayed for several months during the Second World War, so I'd like to share some of their stories with you. Between 1938 and 1940, the United Kingdom temporarily opened its doors to 10,000 mainly Jewish children on the Kindertransports. We've become familiar with imagery of confused children being met by strangers and sent to foster families with barely any preparation. When the Home Office allowed children up to the age of 17 temporary refuge in Britain, it was on the strict understanding that there would be no financial burden on the public purse. As the situation for Jews in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia began to decline rapidly, concerned groups of both Jews and non-Jews across the United Kingdom banded together to aid escape for those being persecuted. These groups worked tirelessly to find private foster homes for refugee children. However, there were other organisations who wanted to bring children over in larger groups where they could focus on their Jewish education and preparation for eventual settlement in Palestine. Shortly after the Kristallnacht pogrom in Germany, which took place on the 9th to the 10th of November in 1938, Jewish Zionist organisations established Hakshirot, which is the plural term for training farms, across the United Kingdom to house groups of hundreds of Jewish teenagers preparing to make Aliyah. Aliyah is the emigration to Palestine, or Israel now. In Wales, a large Hakshirah was established at Gwrych Castle in Abergele, and another much smaller one was formed at Llandac Castle near Cowbridge in South Wales. The Hakshirah movement emerged in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. It was led by Youth Aliyah, which was an Orthodox Jewish group. It espoused the combination of practical agricultural training with Jewish education and Zionist values. Not only did it provide young Jews with agricultural training to prepare them for a new life in Palestine, but it provided many teenage boys and girls with an occupation and a purpose during the German Depression. Now, I researched a lot of the following information during lockdown. I wanted to search for oral histories of people who had stayed on the Hakshirah in Llandac, and due to COVID, the Shoah Foundation made all of their video interviews freely available to researchers via email. You usually have to go to an approved institution for this. The USC Shoah Foundation was originally set up by Steven Spielberg back in 1994 after he directed Schindler's List the year before, and he realized the importance of these stories being told and preserved across the world. The following information has been compiled using self-published books and Shoah Foundation testimony. So due to the rush for sourcing accommodation, many Hakshirot did not have suitable conditions for the arriving teenagers. On the 13th of May, 1939, 12-year-old Mimi Ormond had secured a place on a Kindertransport from Marienbad in Czechoslovakia. Once in England, she was sent to Great Engham Farm in Kent, where the children lived in barracks with stamped down earth for floors and washed in freezing water. The conditions were harsh and numbers on the farm swelled to 200, forcing some of the children to move into disused railroad wagons on the farmland. Mimi recalls it was cold and we got sick. Our housekeeping was with spades to shovel mud out of the wagons. Thea Sonnenmark was born in Vienna in 1921. With the rise of anti-Semitic attacks in Austria, her family decided to leave and secured passage to London in 1938. Thea was fortunate enough to have her parents and not come to England on a kinder transport. She was deeply involved with Zionist causes and had a gift for languages, so was asked to work in the office at Great Engham Farm and help look after the children. She spoke of the same difficult and overcrowded conditions as Mimi, except Thea was lucky enough to have her own private bed in the sick bay. Due to overcrowding, a group from Great Engham Farm were evacuated to Llandacht Castle in South Wales in late 1939, and Thea and Mimi were among them. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, Llandacht Castle was in use by the Ministry of Labour as a juvenile instruction centre for young boys from the valleys who suffered ill health from working in the mines. The use of the castle as a recuperation and training centre for juveniles made it the perfect setting to house young refugees. In 1939, Llandacht Castle's owner, Lady Bias, granted a further lease to house Jewish children. Due to the outbreak of war in September 1939, the Welsh boys were all returned home and staff were given 1 month's notice to vacate. Mimi recalls her transfer to Llandacht Castle with fondness compared to her uncomfortable experiences at Great Engham Farm. It had electricity, running water and heat. It was like heaven. This is a letter sent by Mimi to Llandacht Castle. She eventually married and emigrated to America and brought her grandson back to visit the place she stayed in the UK. Another refugee at Llandacht Castle was Gerard Friedenfeld. When he was 14 in Lunderburg, Czechoslovakia, Nazi soldiers made him jump repeatedly from a tall ladder onto cobblestones below until he broke his leg. He was taken to hospital, where a Jewish couple came to his bedside and asked if he wanted to go to England. Permission was given by his parents, and he set off with 136 other children. Gerard did not arrive on his train alone, but with his best friend Adolf Wodak from his hometown. Gerard and Adolf also began their agricultural training at Great Engham Farm until overcrowding led to their move in October 1939 to Llandacht Castle. He refers to Llandacht as a lovely place and recalls the visit of Joseph Baratz, a messenger from Palestine who was in his 70s but full of life. His job was to keep them enthused for their eventual emigration. He also remembers a teacher by the name of Gideon Topf, who looked after them at Llandacht. Gideon was a doctor, teacher, and sportsman who provided a stable adult figure who the boys could look up to. He recalls being so hungry at Llandacht due to limited funds that they would break into storerooms and steal dry shredded wheat and apples. He said he could never stomach shredded wheat again for the rest of his life. The Jewish community in Cardiff was supportive of the children at Llandacht and often visited with supplies. Thea Sonnenmark remembers a Jewish couple from Cardiff inviting her home for the weekend because she could speak English. The couple were wealthy and had 2 sons. Thea recalled the shock expressed by the family that she spoke Latin, appreciated poetry and could play the piano, and they suddenly developed a new respect for her. Although Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia were viewed as civilized countries at this time, there were occasionally preconceived ideas that the children who arrived on the kinder transports were poor and uneducated. Thea remembers being taken to Cardiff and introduced to other members of the Jewish community as if she was the 7th wonder. It's interesting to examine the feeling that these children were from deprived backgrounds, when in fact many of them came from financially comfortable and well-established families. Mimi Orman's family ran a thriving linen shop in the centre of Marienbad in Czechoslovakia, which they had owned for 3 generations. She lived in a stable home until the Nazis started stripping their rights and property. Mimi poignantly comments that within a year she had gone from a comfortable house to a railroad car. We still seem to regularly equate asylum seekers and refugees with inferiority and view them as arriving in our country to take from us, rather than understanding that many of these individuals had family, homes, and professions they would never have abandoned under normal circumstances. And if given the opportunity, their knowledge and experience could greatly enhance our local communities. Our media often highlights the threat perceived by the wider community in relation to immigrants and refugees. This has often impacted how we select those we believe are worthy of our country's support, both in the past and the present day. This can be clearly seen in the darker and less well-explored side to the selection process that approved those eligible for the Kindertransport. In November 1938, when the Home Secretary announced they would allow unaccompanied children up to the age of 17 temporary refuge in Britain, it was on the understanding that private individuals would financially support them. Having a guarantor in the United Kingdom would also have helped to ease the financial burden on Jewish families in Europe, who had fallen into extreme poverty with the systematic removal of their jobs and property. Some London-based institutions, such as the Central British Fund, began imposing layers of restrictions for the much sought-after spaces, requiring certificates of good physical and mental health, also a good academic record, and assurances had to be made to the Home Office that they would only bring children who were 100% mentally and physically fit. This applies also to guaranteed children. Parents would be asked to fill out forms certifying their child had no mental illness, infectious diseases, or wet the bed. A child's social worth could also be a deciding factor. There are also reports that young refugees were not always received with the most altruistic of intentions. Young adults who'd just missed places on the Kindertransport due to their age had to find other means of escape. Many young women signed up to become domestic servants, and their treatment could be questionable. An example of two sisters, Lily and Hannah Schindler, who eventually settled in South Wales, emphasised this point. The younger sister, Lily, was able to come over on a Kindertransport, but her older sister, Hannah, was not eligible. Hannah was one of 20,000 young Jewish women who were saved through domestic service visas, but the experiences of these young women are not as widely discussed, despite them being the largest single group of refugees who were permitted to enter the United Kingdom during the interwar years. It's likely that their experiences have been recorded as part of the 100,000 Holocaust survivor testimonies held around the world. However, the process of looking critically at these accounts has only just started. Many were unprepared for the backbreaking work which they now had to undertake, as well as the low social status in which they were now viewed. Although many refugees who came to the United Kingdom have a long-lasting gratitude and admiration for the British people for taking them in, many of the young women who entered domestic service felt isolated and unhappy because of their treatment. There was usually a tendency to justify memories of poor treatment, sometimes even involving sexual assault, with the caveat that they were just lucky to have been rescued from the ghettos and camps where many of their families eventually perished. Is it fair to assume that these refugees owe us a debt of gratitude regardless of their treatment by their host families? At what point is that debt considered repaid? Hannah's niece confirms these accounts with stories passed down by her aunt.
So, in this little place in Cornwall, I think they had quite a difficult time, but they managed to integrate and, get on with life. And she learned English pretty well. She did very well at school, so she must have learned English, quite quickly. And then after the war, they came back to London. And she, at one point, she lived in Welwyn Garden City, and I'm not sure if that was with the children's home or not. And then she, her sister, who was nearly 10 years older, she lived in London, and she came over in a different way because she was too old to come on a transport. She had to come and work for a family, which she managed to do through her father's contacts with some people in the industries in Wales, in England. So she came and worked in a lady's house as her sort of housemaid. And again, she also didn't have a very good time. She didn't get time off, wasn't treated very nicely. But she did have a couple of people that her family knew in London. So she managed to be able to see them. And then she met her husband, I think at one of the refugee clubs, went to move to Wales because, again, for the industry, they were manufacturers of costume jewellery. So she moved to Wales, and then once she got married, my mum went to live with her in Llandaff, where she and her husband had a flat. And my mother lived there with her then in Cardiff, and then her life then carried on in Cardiff. She met my dad at one of the Jewish youth clubs, and then that was it. They got married and then stayed in Cardiff.
These expectations of service occasionally led to clashes with host families. Ellen Kerry Davis, who came to live with a host family in Swansea, had a good relationship with her foster father, but constantly felt berated by her foster mother. After the death of her foster father, she was expected to work in the family business, then return home to clean and cook. If Ellen dared to question anything, her foster mother would say, "You ungrateful child, if it had not been for me, you would be in the gas chambers with your family." The experiences of the children at the Hackshirot were very different to those in a private home setting, but they were not without challenges. The teenagers on the training farms could not escape suspicion that they were potential enemy aliens. In 1940, Llandacht Castle estate was requisitioned by the government, and members of the Canadian Air Force were billeted there. The pilots were stationed at RAF Landau or RAF St. Athan, which were both within 5 miles of the castle. Abraham Summer, who was around 17 years old when he was staying on the Hackshirot at Llandacht, believes it was the presence of these airfields which led to their relocation to North Wales. Other refugees felt that the move was for the safety of the children. Gerard Friedenfeld described nights spent in fear, huddled in the thick-walled corridors of the castle waiting for a stray bomb to hit them. But Abraham Summer's feelings that the British were becoming ever more fearful of potential enemy aliens were well-founded. The large number of refugees entering the United Kingdom led the government to consider them as a threat to national security. In April 1939, a subcommittee of the Committee of Imperial Defence on Control of Aliens in War decided that should war break out, general internment of refugees would be inevitable from an early date. An enemy alien was defined as a person who possesses the nationality of a state at war with His Majesty. As war progressed, one of the first acts of Winston Churchill's government, formed in May 1940, was to pass a policy to incarcerate all those with backgrounds that posed a threat to national security, and these would be people between the ages of 16 and 60. This led to some of the older Jewish teenagers being imprisoned or deported. It's interesting to note that of the roughly 28,000 aliens interned at this time, relatively few were Nazis or Nazi sympathizers, with over 80% being Jewish refugees. Gerard Friedenfeld clearly remembers a Monday morning at Llandacht Castle, looking out of the window and seeing plainclothed men coming from all sides up the hill. They took away every male over the age of 16, and Gerard was thankful that he was 3 months shy of his 16th birthday. Many of the internees were taken to camps on the Isle of Man, and once these became full, they were put on ships to Australia and Canada. All of the boys taken from Llandacht were interrogated, but returned to the group within 6 months. Although general feeling at this time was one of suspicion, there were many supporters for the Austrian, German, and Czechoslovakian Jewish refugees throughout Wales. The Llandacht Castle News describes the plight of the young men as driven from Germany as Jews, interned in England as Germans, which highlighted sympathetic feelings of the local community to this incident. As early as 1933, when Nazis began boycotting German Jewish businesses, 2 large protest meetings were held in Swansea and Pontypridd. The Jewish Chronicle reported 2,000 people attending the Pontypridd protest. Thousands also mobbed a group of Mosley's black shirt fascists in Tonypandy in 1936. I was also pleased to note that this anti-fascist feeling continued in South Wales with this newspaper report from 1963. A speaker from Mosley's union movement had to cancel their meeting to the Barry Island Christian Men's Fellowship after protests from Jews and Muslims and a number of other organisations in the area. Although general public opinion, supported by the media, did view enemy aliens with suspicion and were at one stage supportive of the government's internment policies, it did not take long for popular opinion to reverse, with the general feeling moving from intern the lot to free them now by June 1940. The experiences shared by these Jewish youngsters created a firm bond between them. Many never saw their parents or siblings again, so these children became each other's families. Abraham Summer describes how he always moved together with the same group of about 70 or 80 youngsters, and they formed close friendships and had a lot in common. He even went on to marry another refugee, Greta, who had been with him at Llandacht. Over the years, Abraham and Greta kept in contact with each other and other members of their group, including Ruth Ehrman, who was previously Clara. After Greta and then Ruth's husband passed away in the early 1990s, the 2 families joined together when Abraham and Ruth got married in October 1996. The shared history and bonds that formed between these youngsters carried them through life after the extreme trauma of their childhood. So to finish, I'd just like to give you a very brief overview of the reasons for the decline of the Jewish community in South Wales. The decline of heavy industry and mining in the area had a huge impact on the supportive businesses run by Jewish families. As communities collapsed, many of the Jewish businesses suffered, and they would have moved away, many to Cardiff or further afield to larger Jewish communities across the UK. Other factors which contributed to the decline in more recent years were the younger generation moving away to study or marry. As the community was so small, there was not much choice if you did not meet someone you clicked with. As this generation settled and had families, many of the older generation would relocate to be near to their children and grandchildren. The lack of Jewish schools in South Wales has also been a contributing factor for those more orthodox families who wanted their children to attend a Jewish school. This has resulted in the Valley's community slowly vanishing over the decades, and even the larger towns and cities are declining rapidly. Interestingly, census results between 2011 and 2021 show that although the community in Cardiff is declining, there are a number of areas in Wales where the number of Jewish residents are increasing. Although due to lack of amenities, they are unlikely to be members of a synagogue in places like Carmarthen or Pembrokeshire. In the Vale of Glamorgan, the numbers have increased quite significantly from 85 to 143 in 10 years. So only a very small number of Jewish families now choose to settle in Wales, a situation which is not helped by the lack of educational provisions and now no access to kosher food in the whole of South Wales. This is now brought in from other areas of the UK in a refrigerated van every 3 weeks to Cardiff United Synagogue. The community is now made up of mainly elderly members, and we continue to hear of members who have recently passed away. And we have often been lucky enough to record their stories so that their memories of Jewish life in Wales is always preserved. So thank you for joining me today, and if you would like any further information about who we are and what we do as an organisation, then here are our contact details. Thank you.